The camera opens on a single drop of water falling from a cracked ceiling. Drip, drip. Each sound echoes through a stone corridor deep beneath Berlin. February 1944. The walls sweat with damp and secrets. A bare bulb swings from a wire, slicing shadows across a wooden table stained with tobacco and fear. Two men sit in silence, one in a black Gestapo uniform, boots polished to a mirror, the other in rags of what was once a Royal Air Force flight suit, wrists bound by leather straps darkened with sweat. His name is Flight Lieutenant James Alistair Henderson. Serial No. 42067, age 26. Captured 3 nights ago after his Spitfire went down over the Ruhr. His face is swollen, his lips split, yet his eyes, pale blue and blinking, are steady. The interrogator studies him like a specimen under glass. A single cigarette burns between them, its smoke winding upward until it vanishes into the darkness above. Outside the room, boots click in the hallway. A typewriter rattles, stops. Somewhere a man screams once, then silence. The Gestapo officer finally speaks, his German clipped, precise. Name, rank, and unit. Henderson's mouth twitches. Blood crusts at the corner of his lip. James Alistair Henderson. Flight Lieutenant. Royal Air Force. The tone is flat, mechanical. The repetition of duty drilled into him since training. The officer nods, writes it down, then leans forward, voice soft. Your squadron, your base? Who are you flying with? No answer. The officer taps the cigarette ash onto the table. You think silence will protect you? I can have you sent to the eastern camps by nightfall. Men vanish there, he smiles thinly. But if you cooperate, Lieutenant, you might see home again. Maybe even tonight, the air hums. Henderson breathes slowly through his nose, counting each inhale. He knows the rule, never engage, never improvise. But his mind flickers through images. His wingman spiraling in flame, the parachute canopy blooming, the sound of the wind. Then the searchlights, then the dogs. The officer lights another cigarette, smoke curling like fog between them. Tell me about Operation Halberd. Henderson's pulse spikes. They know the name. His eyes give nothing. The officer watches for that nothing. The twitch of a muscle, the dilation of a pupil. The tiny betrayals men make when truth brushes the edge of fear. I see, the officer says quietly. You are trained, very well. Then we shall talk as gentlemen. He leans back, studying him. Every man has a word that breaks him. For some it is mother, for others home. I will find yours. The clock ticks. Outside, a freight train passes. The low thunder of wheels beneath the city. The sound shakes dust from the ceiling. Henderson raises his head slowly. The bulb above flickers. I'll save you the effort, he says hoarsely. My word's already chosen, the officer smiles.
And what is it?
Henderson looks him in the eye. A single bead of blood runs from his temple to his jaw. His voice is calm. You. The officer freezes, the faintest shift in his expression, confusion, then curiosity. Me? Henderson nods. That's the word you'll remember when this is over. The cigarette trembles slightly in the officer's hand. In that instant, something unseen changes. A balance tilts, a seed is planted. The interrogator doesn't know it yet, but the prisoner has just taken control of the room. One word, you, the sound fades. The bulb swings once more. The drip resumes. The moment of capture never happens all at once. It begins as a sound, faint, distant, like the world holding its breath, and then it closes around you. For Flight Lieutenant James Alistair Henderson, it began high above the Ruhr, on a February night so cold it felt like glass could shatter in midair. The moon hung behind cloud veils, pale and distant, illuminating nothing. His Spitfire's engine hummed beneath him, steady as a heartbeat. Below, the earth glowed in intermittent flashes, flak bursts rising from the industrial valley like fireworks designed by madmen. He was 26, on his third reconnaissance run that month, photographing German rail yards near Essen for Bomber Command. He had done this flight so many times that he could recite the pattern of anti-aircraft fire like a lullaby. 2 seconds between bursts, then a pause. Count to 5, adjust heading, repeat. But this night, the rhythm was wrong. At 23:19, a new light bloomed to his left. A quick orange spark, growing fast. Henderson jerked his head toward it. A tracer, then another, then a dozen. His radio crackled. a voice half drowned by static. "Henderson, this is Viper 1, break south, break south." Then the world exploded. A flak shell burst under his right wing, the concussion slamming through his ribs. The cockpit glass shattered inward. Wind screamed through the frame. Instruments spun. The smell of burning oil filled his lungs. Henderson fought the stick, muscles seizing, trying to level the aircraft, but the controls went slack. Elevator cables severed. The Spitfire rolled violently, the horizon turning end over end. He had 3 seconds to decide. He pulled the canopy release, felt it rip away. Cold air punched his face. The harness resisted once, then he was out. The parachute snapped open with a force that nearly tore his shoulders apart. Above him, his plane spiraled downward, a comet of fire that struck the forest below in a bloom of white-orange light. For a heartbeat, the world was silent again, save for the wind and his own ragged breathing. Then came the distant barking of dogs. He drifted downward through the darkness, snowflakes whipping past like sparks. The land below was all shadow and silver. He hit hard, knees buckling, rolled through snow and dirt. The parachute caught on a tree branch, the silk rustling like whispers. He cut himself free, crouched low, listening. No voices, only the wind. He began to move east toward the faint line of the river. His compass was gone, his gloves soaked. Every step crunched like gunfire. He told himself the same words they all did after a crash. "You're still alive." That's the hardest part done, but he knew better. The hardest part was about to begin. He walked for an hour before the first light appeared. Not dawn, but lanterns, swinging faintly through the trees ahead. Henderson dropped to the ground, heart hammering. Voices followed. German, clipped and deliberate, moving closer. He pressed himself into the frozen earth, breath shallow. Then a shout, "Halt!" The beam of a flashlight cut through the branches, slicing across his boots. He ran. Branches tore at his face as he crashed through the undergrowth. The forest erupted with noise, dogs barking, shouts echoing, the sharp crack of rifles. Bullets hissed through the trees, snapping wood. He stumbled down a slope, slid into a ditch, mud filling his boots. Somewhere behind him a flare went up, turning the forest into day. He reached a fence line, wire strung between posts, and vaulted over. A second too slow. A hand grabbed his ankle, dragging him down. He kicked, connecting with a face, heard a shout of pain, but another set of hands seized his collar. The butt of a rifle slammed into the side of his head once, twice. White light flashed behind his eyes. When he woke, he was on his back, hands bound, snow melting against his skin. The German soldiers stood around him, young faces under steel helmets, their breath fogging the air. One of them, older with a sergeant's stripes, knelt beside him and searched his pockets, removing his identification tag and a small photograph of his sister. He examined it briefly, then slipped it into his own coat. Henderson's vision swam. He tried to focus on the sky, still faintly glowing with the fires from his crash. The sergeant looked down at him. "Englishman," he said simply, almost kindly, "for you the war is over." Then the butt of the rifle came down again and the world went black. He woke to the sound of engines, a truck grinding along a frozen road. His head throbbed with every jolt. The air smelled of diesel and sweat. He was lying on the wooden floor of a transport lorry, hands bound behind his back, boots missing. Across from him sat 2 Luftwaffe guards, their Mausers resting casually between their knees. Through the slats of the truck, Henderson caught glimpses of the countryside passing. Bare trees, snowfields, the occasional farmhouse with its roof caved in. The sun had risen pale and distant. A signpost flashed past, Essen at 12 kilometers. He spoke once, voice rasping. "Water." One of the guards looked over, then reached into his canteen and poured a thin stream onto Henderson's cracked lips. It was warmer than he expected. The man said nothing. By afternoon, they reached a compound surrounded by barbed wire, a Luftwaffe interrogation center. Inside, British prisoners milled about the yard, thin and hollow-eyed. Some looked up as Henderson was led past, curiosity dull in their faces. The guards marched him into a low building down a corridor lined with closed doors. He could hear voices through one, English spoken under duress, then a scream that rose and fell. Another door opened briefly, revealing a man slumped in a chair, head lolling. The guard beside Henderson said something in German and pushed him forward. They descended a flight of concrete steps. The air grew colder, damper. At the bottom was a small room with a table, 2 chairs, a single light bulb. On the table sat a metal cup, a folder, and a half-smoked cigarette. The guard shoved him inside. "Sit," Henderson did. The door closed with the finality of a cell door in a dream. He waited. Minutes passed. His breath steamed in the cold. The bulb flickered. He could feel his pulse in his temples, the slow throb of exhaustion and fear. He remembered the instruction drilled into every pilot before missions. If captured, give name, rank, number. Nothing more. He repeated it under his breath until it became a mantra. Then the door opened and a man entered. Tall, immaculate, wearing a black leather trench coat that caught the light like oil. His face was sharp, eyes pale behind wire-rimmed glasses. In his hand was a thin file. "Flight Lieutenant James Alistair Henderson," the man said in English, his accent crisp. "Welcome to Dulag Luft." Henderson stared straight ahead. The man smiled faintly, sat opposite him, and opened the file. "You were shot down near Essen. Your squadron, reconnaissance, yes?" He looked up. "You are a guest of the Reich now, Mr. Henderson. My name is Herr Kruger. I prefer conversation to cruelty. For both our sakes." No response. Kruger tapped the file. "You carry maps of the Ruhr. These were found near your wreck. Why photograph rail yards if not for bombing plans?" Henderson recited quietly. "Name, rank, number. Flight Lieutenant James Alistair Henderson, 40 Contobi 67. Kruger smiled again, this time wider. You play by the book." "Very British." He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "But books burn easily, Lieutenant. And pages scream." Henderson met his gaze, unflinching. The silence between them stretched until even the bulb seemed to hum louder. Then Kruger stood, collected the file, and walked to the door. "We will continue tomorrow," he said. "You will find that memory is easier to loosen when the body is tired." The door closed. The lock clicked. Henderson exhaled, slow and steady, and whispered to himself, 1 hour at a time. That night he was thrown into a cell barely large enough to stretch his legs. A single blanket lay on the concrete floor. The walls sweated moisture. From somewhere above came the sound of footsteps and running water. He pressed his back against the corner and listened. The faint murmurs of other prisoners came through the walls, scraps of English, Polish, French. The war had collected them all here, one broken voice at a time. He closed his eyes and thought of home. The cliffs near Dover, the sound of gulls, the taste of rain on sea wind. He tried to hold the image, but it slipped through his fingers like everything else. Sleep came in fits, haunted by engines and fire. At dawn, the door opened again. The guards dragged him up the stairs, back into the interrogation room. The same table, the same light, the same smell of smoke and iron. But this time, Kruger was already waiting, his uniform immaculate, a new cigarette burning in the ashtray. "Good morning, Lieutenant," he said pleasantly. "Did you dream?" Henderson didn't answer. Kruger studied him for a long moment, then said, "Dreams are dangerous. They remind men of who they were. Let's talk instead about who you are." He laid out a series of photographs, aerial images of the Ruhr. "These are yours, yes?" "Your handwriting on the back. Tell me what you were looking for." Henderson's jaw clenched. "Name, rank, number." Kruger smiled thinly. "That phrase will become tedious, I think. Let's try a different one." He picked up a piece of paper and read aloud in German, "Operation Halberd, Phase 2 deployment." He looked up. "You see? We already know more than you imagine. Tell me where the next strikes will be. Tell me and you can go to a proper camp. Refuse and—" He gestured vaguely toward the ceiling. "You've heard them." The silence stretched. The bulb buzzed. Then Henderson spoke, his voice low. "You can threaten me, starve me, break me, but there's only one word that'll ever matter here." Kruger's brow furrowed. "And what word is that?" Henderson looked him dead in the eye. No, it wasn't loud. It wasn't defiant. It was final. The sound of it settled in the air like a nail in wood. Kruger stared at him for a long time. Then he nodded slowly, almost with respect. "We'll see how long that word lasts." He stood, signaled the guards. As they dragged Henderson out, Kruger called after him, voice cold and certain. "One day you'll replace it with something else. Everyone does." Henderson didn't turn back. The cell door groaned open before dawn. 2 guards entered without speaking. Their boots scraped the stone floor and their breath smoked in the cold air. Henderson barely had time to stand before rough hands pulled him into the corridor. The chain at his wrists bit into his skin. They led him upward through a stairwell slick with condensation. The faint hum of generators vibrated through the concrete. Somewhere above, a radio played a waltz, faint, distorted by distance, the melody dissolving into static as they climbed. He knew where he was going now. The room. When they reached it, the same yellow light burned overhead, casting the same circle of illumination across the table. The ashtray had been emptied. The smell of stale smoke lingered like memory. Herr Kruger waited, polished and expressionless, a man carved from patience. "Good morning, Lieutenant," he said, switching effortlessly to English. "Sleep well?" Henderson said nothing. Kruger gestured to the chair. "Please." The guards pushed him down and stepped back. Kruger took his seat opposite, crossing one leg over the other, notebook balanced neatly in his lap. "We begin again, perhaps with something simple. Where were you born?" Silence. Kruger smiled. "You see? We can talk about anything. A town, a school, a favorite book. Not all conversations must end with pain." Still silence. Henderson's eyes were steady, though the edges of the world pulsed faintly from hunger and concussion. He fixed on the single bulb above, a small, trembling sun. Kruger leaned forward. "You are not the first man to believe silence is a weapon. It is not. It is merely another form of confession." He opened the notebook, revealing a list of names. "Your squadron, no, 141, based in Sussex. 2 missing, 1 confirmed dead. You see, we already know so much. But there are blanks." "I do not like blanks." He looked up. "Who commanded you?" Henderson's mouth was dry. "Name, rank, number," he murmured. Kruger's pen paused mid-stroke. "So formal," he said softly. "You cling to your liturgy." He rose, paced slowly behind him. "Do you believe in God, Lieutenant?" Henderson didn't answer. "I do," Kruger continued. "Not the sentimental English God with tea and hymns, but the one who writes everything down. The one who remembers." He came to stand beside him, voice low. "You think I am your enemy, but we are the same. We both record truth. Only one of us survives it." He placed a hand on Henderson's shoulder. The touch was almost gentle. Then he pressed down hard, forcing him against the table. "Tell me the target for next week's bombing run." Henderson's jaw tightened. He stared at the tabletop grain until his vision blurred. Then quietly he said, "No." Kruger's breath hissed through his teeth. He nodded once to the guards. The first blow came fast, and a fist to the ribs. Henderson folded but did not fall. The second landed across the face, splitting his lip again. The taste of copper flooded his mouth. The world tilted, steadied. He straightened slowly. Kruger watched with clinical detachment. "You are proud. Good. Pride lasts longer than courage." He signaled the guards to stop. "Enough. He will talk better if he can breathe." They stepped back. Henderson wiped his mouth with his sleeve, smearing blood across the faded RAF insignia. Kruger lit a cigarette, inhaled deeply, exhaled toward the ceiling. "You see, Lieutenant, everyone talks. Some after 5 minutes, some after 5 days, but all before the end. What matters is not if, but how." He leaned close enough that the smoke brushed Henderson's cheek. "And I think you will talk with elegance." Hours bled together. Questions came like artillery, relentless, precise. Designed not to kill but to erode. Names, units, codes. Every time, Henderson answered the same. Name, rank, number. Every time, Kruger smiled a little thinner. By the 3rd day, they had stopped offering food. Water came once daily in a tin cup, cloudy and metallic. Sleep became fragments, snatched minutes between footsteps in the corridor. When he closed his eyes, he dreamed of sky, sunlight through canopy glass, the hum of the engine. Then he woke to stone. On the 4th morning, Kruger entered carrying 2 cups of coffee. He placed one in front of Henderson. Steam rose between them. "Drink," he said. Henderson hesitated, then took a sip. Bitter, burnt, but real. Kruger sat. "Tell me something true and I will tell you something true." Fair exchange. Silence. "All right," Kruger said, folding his hands. "My truth first. I studied English at Cambridge before the war. 1936. Your country was kind to me then. I admired it. The discipline, the arrogance," he smiled faintly. "Perhaps I still do." He waited. "Now your turn." Henderson looked up slowly. His voice was hoarse. "I once flew over Cambridge. Clear day. You could see the chapel roof glinting in the sun." Kruger's eyebrows lifted. "Good, you see? Not so difficult. We are 2 civilized men, yes?" The moment hung, fragile, almost human. Then Kruger's tone hardened. Tell me about Operation Halberd. Henderson's eyes dropped to the cup. No. Kruger's sigh was theatrical, weary. Then we returned to less civilized methods. He stood, nodded to the guards, and left. The men moved in. Henderson braced. The first strike drove him to the floor. Boots followed. Each impact came from far away like echoes underwater. Somewhere in the noise he heard his own voice counting, not out of defiance but survival. Numbers steadied him. 3, 4, 5. When they stopped, he lay curled, breathing through broken rhythm. One guard muttered, "Stubborn bastard," before dragging him upright. Through swollen eyes, Henderson saw the table again. The coffee cup had fallen, dark liquid spreading like a map of some new endless country. Night again, or something like it. Time no longer belonged to hours, but to the space between interrogations. The cell's small window showed only the thin outline of frost. He heard footsteps, lighter this time. The door opened. Kruger entered alone, no guards. He carried no file. Instead, he held a single photograph. He sat opposite, slid it across the table. It was of a woman, smiling, hair tied back, standing before an English cottage. The edges were frayed. Your sister, yes? Anna. Henderson's breath caught. Kruger's voice was quiet. You see, Lieutenant, we are thorough. We know addresses, occupations. She works with the Postal Service in Dover. Pretty. Proud. It would be unfortunate if... Don't. The word escaped before he could stop it. Kruger studied him, the faintest curve at the corner of his mouth. Ah, so there is a word that moves you. Henderson forced himself to look away. She has nothing to do with this. Everything has to do with this. Kruger's tone was almost kind. Say something useful and I promise her name disappears from every list. Henderson swallowed hard. His hands trembled against the cuffs. Then he looked up, eyes burning with something beyond fear. You think threats make you powerful, but they make you predictable. Kruger blinked. Predictable? Yes. Henderson leaned forward, voice steady despite the tremor in it. Because every man who uses them ends the same way, terrified of the silence after his own words. Kruger's face tightened. Careful, but Henderson didn't stop. You said everyone breaks. Maybe you're right, but you'll break first, not from what I say, from what you see when I don't. For a long moment, neither moved. Only the bulb swayed slightly, its shadow carving lines between them. Kruger stood abruptly, hand trembling as he stubbed out his cigarette. Enough, his voice cracked the air. He turned for the door. Tomorrow we continue. When he left, the guards didn't come. Henderson sat alone, blood drying on his collar, the photograph still face down on the table. The silence that followed was almost a victory, days blurred. The rhythm became ritual. Question, refusal, blow, silence. Yet something inside Kruger was shifting. The prisoner's refusal wasn't defiance anymore. It was reflection. Every no landed not as rebellion, but as mirror. By the 10th day, Kruger stopped ordering the beatings. He simply sat opposite Henderson, talking about politics, music, weather. Henderson answered with single syllables or not at all. The interrogations had turned into conversations neither man could abandon. On the 12th night, the lights flickered during an air raid. Sirens wailed faintly above. Dust rained from the ceiling. Kruger looked up, listening to the thunder of bombs in the distance. Your bombers, he said quietly. Your people kill without seeing faces. You are lucky, Henderson whispered. You're hearing what you made. Kruger's expression faltered. For a moment, the officer looked very small, very tired. He exhaled and said, almost to himself, Perhaps we both are. The next morning, the guards were gone. Only Kruger came. He unlocked the cuffs himself and slid a loaf of bread across the table. Eat, he said. Henderson tore it apart with shaking hands, chewing slowly. Kruger watched, then said softly, You have won something, I think. I do not know what, but I feel it. He stood, buttoned his coat. Tomorrow I am transferred east. Another officer will take my place. He will not be as patient. He stood, buttoned his coat. Tomorrow I am transferred east. Another officer will take my place. He will not be as patient. Henderson swallowed, voice barely a whisper. What happens to me? Kruger paused at the door. You survive. Perhaps that is punishment enough. He left the key on the table, a small, deliberate act that neither man named. Henderson stared at it for a long time, then closed his hand around the cold metal. The key felt heavier than metal. Henderson turned it over in his palm until the edges pressed half-moon shapes into his skin. The sound of Kruger's footsteps faded down the hall, swallowed by the hum of the generators. The room was still, save for the slow drip of water somewhere behind the walls. He stared at the door. It was unlocked now, technically. A gift, a test, or both. The kind of gesture that meant everything and nothing in war. He could leave the room. But not the building. Not the city. Berlin was a labyrinth of walls and uniforms, and he was a single unarmed man with a face every patrol would recognize. He closed his hand around the key once more, then set it back on the table. Freedom meant little without meaning, and meaning was all he had left. The next morning, the guards came for him again. A new officer followed. Younger, sharper, his uniform unwrinkled, his eyes untested. Hauptsturmführer Dieter Weber, Krüger's replacement. He entered with the stiffness of a man desperate to prove efficiency. "We will not waste time," Weber said in clipped German-accented English. "You will answer directly. If not, I have authorization to send you to Mauthausen." Henderson sat motionless. Name, rank, number. Weber's jaw tightened. "You people think those 3 words make you untouchable." He slammed his fist on the table. "But here, words decide who breathes." Henderson looked up slowly. "Then choose yours carefully," Weber blinked. "Excuse me?" "Words," Henderson said evenly. "They're all that's left when uniforms are gone." The officer's face hardened. "Enough philosophy. You are not Kruger's friend. You are a file, a variable, a problem to be solved." He snapped his fingers. The guards hauled Henderson to his feet. "Stand." Henderson's knees trembled from hunger, but he stood. Weber leaned close, his breath sharp with coffee. "Tell me your operations target." "No." A backhand caught his cheek, spinning him sideways. The room blurred. Weber grabbed his chin, forcing his head up. "You will answer me, Englishman, or I will erase your existence." Henderson spat blood onto the floor. "Then you'll have nothing left to fear." Weber froze, unsure how to reply. Rage wasn't working. Fear wasn't working. He turned to the guards. "Leave us." They hesitated, then obeyed. The door closed. Weber circled the table like a predator gauging distance. "You think you understand us," he said. "You think your silence humiliates me? But I've studied your kind, the quiet martyrs. They all break. Do you know why?" Henderson said nothing. "Because silence," Weber continued, "turns inward. It devours the mind. You begin to speak to ghosts. You think you're holding your ground, but you're drowning in your own thoughts." He stopped behind Henderson. "And then you say a word you don't mean. A single word. That's all it takes." Hours passed. Weber left him there, wrists chained to the table, the light burning endlessly. The silence stretched until even the ticking clock felt like mockery. When the door opened again, it wasn't Weber. It was Kruger. The older officer entered quietly, closing the door behind him. He no longer wore his cap. His hair was graying at the temples. His face looked thinner, older. "So," Kruger said, "my successor wastes no time." Henderson's throat was dry. "He's not subtle." "No," Kruger agreed, almost smiling. "But efficiency has its admirers." He moved closer. "I have returned to collect my notes, and perhaps to see if you still live." "I do," Henderson murmured. "Barely." Kruger studied him for a long moment. "You interest me, Lieutenant. You think in lines of logic, not loyalty. You use silence as a scalpel. Tell me, what do you gain by it?" Henderson's answer came softly. "Choice." Kruger raised an eyebrow. "Choice in here?" "In here, it's the only thing left that's mine." The words hung between them, weightless and heavy all at once. Kruger set his gloves on the table, leaning forward until their faces were inches apart. "You're wrong. Even choice can be engineered. Men are simple, pain, hunger, hope. Alter one, and they bend." Henderson's eyes met his. "Then bend me." Kruger's lips twitched, amusement or respect or both. "You really are English," he stepped back. "Very well. You want choice? Then choose the word that defines this war for you. Say it and I will end this interrogation. No tricks?" Henderson looked at him for a long time. The bulb flickered, casting both faces in alternating light and shadow. Then, with a voice that sounded like gravel scraping glass, he said the word. "You." Kruger frowned. "Me?" Henderson nodded once. "That's the word. The only one that matters here." Kruger's composure faltered. "Explain." "It's simple," Henderson said. Every question you ask, every order you give, every cruelty you justify, and it isn't the Reich. It's you. The man behind the uniform. The one who could stop but doesn't. He leaned forward, chains clinking softly. When this ends, and it will, they'll hang men for what they did in rooms like this. And when the record asks who gave the orders, your name will be written. You. Kruger's expression hardened, but his breathing quickened. Henderson pressed on. You think I'm powerless because I'm chained. But I have something you don't. I still know who I am. You don't. You traded that for obedience. That's why you fear this room. You see yourself reflected in the men you break. For the first time, Kruger stepped back. His face had drained of color. Enough. But Henderson's voice was steady now, stronger. That's why I chose the word. Because when you sleep, you'll hear it. When the bombs fall, you'll hear it. When the war ends, when you stand in front of the men who will judge you, they'll ask who you were, and you'll say nothing. Because the word that breaks you isn't truth or pain. It's you. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the bulb seemed to stop humming. Kruger's hand trembled around his cigarette. The match he struck broke in half. He tried again, slower this time. The flame caught, shaking faintly. You think words are weapons, he whispered. They are, Henderson said, but not mine. Yours. When Kruger finally left the room, he didn't speak to the guards. He walked straight to his office, closed the door, and sat in the dark. Outside, snow began to fall, soft, endless, muffling the city. He poured a drink and stared at his reflection in the glass pane. For the first time, the face staring back felt foreign. That night, Kruger didn't sign the transfer order to send Henderson east. He wrote instead, to remain under interrogation. Special supervision required. It was a bureaucratic nothing, but it meant life. 2 days later, Allied bombers roared over Berlin. Sirens screamed through the city. Dust rained from the ceilings of the underground complex. Guards shouted orders. Henderson lay on the cell floor, covering his head as the walls trembled. The building shook with each detonation, the sound of the sky collapsing. When it ended, the corridor filled with smoke and shouting. Doors were flung open. Prisoners stumbled into the haze, coughing. A guard ran past, shouting orders that no one heard. Henderson pushed himself upright. The lock on his cell hung twisted from the blast. He stepped into the corridor, blinking through dust. Flames licked from a ruptured fuel line, turning the air orange. He staggered toward the stairwell, then stopped. A body lay in the hall, pinned beneath debris. Kruger. His coat was torn, one arm trapped under a fallen beam. He was conscious, barely. His glasses lay shattered beside him. Henderson hesitated only a moment before moving closer. He grabbed the beam, tried to lift it. Kruger groaned, eyes fluttering open. You, he whispered. Henderson almost laughed. Yes, me. He heaved, straining until the beam shifted just enough for Kruger to pull free. The officer collapsed against the wall, gasping. Henderson crouched beside him. Can you walk? Kruger nodded weakly. Why help me? Because I meant what I said, Henderson replied. We both have to live with the word. He helped him to his feet. Together they staggered toward the exit, smoke swirling around them like fog. When they reached the courtyard, dawn was breaking through the haze. Fires burned across the city, columns of smoke rising into the pale sky. In the distance, air raid sirens wailed one last time before fading into silence. Kruger turned to Henderson, eyes hollow. If they find you, they'll shoot you. Then they'd better be fast, Henderson said. He took a step backward, then another. Kruger didn't stop him, didn't call for guards, didn't move at all. When Henderson reached the gate, he looked back once. Kruger was still there, standing amid the ruins of his own certainty, staring after him like a man watching his reflection walk away. The smoke over Berlin rose like a second sky. From every quarter of the ruined city came the metallic roar of collapsing steel, the far boom of delayed explosions, the deep, living silence that follows the passing of death. Flight Lieutenant James Henderson moved through that silence one step at a time, his body an inventory of pain. The leather straps had rubbed his wrists raw. Blood from the cut at his temple had dried into a stiff line across his cheek. The air outside tasted of brick dust and cordite. He had no weapon, no map, no food, only the name of the river, Spree, and the fading thought that if he followed it west he might outwalk the Reich itself. Behind him, the interrogation building burned from the top floor down, windows flickering orange against the pale dawn, Somewhere inside, the walls still held echoes. You. He didn't look back again. The streets were a labyrinth of rubble. Facades leaned inward like broken teeth. Tram lines hung in the air, severed and sagging. Civil defense crews picked through ruins with shovels and buckets, their faces gray with ash. Every few hundred yards, a poster still clung to a wall. Hitler stared defiant beneath a veil of soot. No one saluted it now. Henderson kept to the shadows, limping, the noise of his boots swallowed by the soft snow that had begun to fall again. He passed a woman kneeling beside a toppled wagon, gathering spilled potatoes into her apron. When she saw his uniform, she froze, then looked away, pretending not to notice. The war had made invisibility a form of mercy. He turned down a side street that ended in a collapsed bridge. Beyond it, the river shimmered under a film of oil and frost. Across the water rose the jagged outline of warehouses, brick shells half-roofed, perfect for hiding. He climbed down the embankment, waded into the shallows. The water numbed him instantly. By the time he reached the far side, his limbs felt carved from stone. Inside the warehouse, he found silence and shadow. The floor was littered with paper, ration slips, torn manifests, soot-stained ledgers. He tore a strip from one and bound his hand. Then he sank against a wall and closed his eyes. Sleep came not as rest, but as collapse. When he woke, it was night again. The city glowed faintly with distant fires. Somewhere a church bell rang without rhythm, swinging loose in its frame. Henderson pushed himself upright, mind sharpening through exhaustion. He needed to move before dawn. Patrols would return to the streets once the bombing ended. He made his way north through alleys and train yards, guided by the faint hum of the S-Bahn lines. Freight cars stood derailed on twisted tracks, their sides marked with chalk numbers. He climbed into one, searching. Inside were sacks of grain and a broken lantern. He tore open a bag, ate handfuls of dry kernels until his jaw ached, then slept again, buried in the smell of dust and wheat. By morning, the sound of trucks woke him. Voices shouted in German, soldiers clearing wreckage near the rail yard. Henderson slipped out the far side of the carriage, keeping low. He moved between rows of twisted metal, every motion deliberate until he reached the outer fence. Beyond it stretched the industrial district, smokestacks, cranes, frozen canals. And somewhere west, if the maps in his memory were right, lay the Tiergarten and the edge of the government quarter, chaos enough to hide in. He found a bicycle half buried in debris. The tires were flat, but the chain still turned. He pushed it along, using it as a crutch more than transport. Snow began to fall harder now, thick flakes muting the city's bones. Near noon, he heard the sound of boots, 2 soldiers rounding a corner ahead. He ducked into a doorway, breath caught in his throat. They passed within yards, laughing, one of them carrying a loaf of bread under his arm. He watched their reflections disappear in a puddle, then stepped out again. He didn't realize he'd been followed until the voice spoke behind him. "Stop, Hände hoch!" Henderson turned slowly. A soldier stood 10 paces away, rifle raised. Young, no older than 19. The boy's helmet sat crooked on his head. His scarf was a child's knitted wool. They stared at each other for a long heartbeat. Then the boy lowered the rifle slightly. "You are English?" Henderson nodded. The boy glanced around, nervous. There was bombing all night. Half the city gone. Go west. Fast. He shoved a crust of bread into Henderson's hand, then turned and vanished between the ruins before the air could record his kindness. By dusk, Henderson reached the Tiergarten. The park had become a wilderness, trees splintered, statues toppled, foxes bolted from hunger. The frozen lake glimmered like tarnished glass. He followed its edge until he saw the outline of the Brandenburg Gate, black against a sky the color of smoke. He was halfway across the open ground when he heard another voice. Quiet, uncertain. "Henderson," he froze. From the shadow of a burned kiosk stepped Kruger. No uniform now, only a dark coat collar turned up, cap pulled low. His right arm was bandaged. His face was drawn but alive. For a moment neither spoke. Then Kruger said, "I thought you would already be gone." "I was," Henderson answered. "Almost." Kruger approached slowly, boots crunching the thin ice. "You saved my life. I had to see it meant something." "It did," Henderson said. "You're standing." Kruger studied him. "You could turn me in. The Allies will want names. I'm not here for revenge." "Then what?" Henderson looked past him toward the west, where the horizon flickered with artillery. An end, Kruger nodded. There won't be one. Not for men like us. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small envelope, edges singed. Take this. Papers, route markings. It will get you as far as the American lines. Henderson hesitated. Why? Because I need to know the word still matters. Henderson took it. It does. They stood facing each other, the city groaning around them. Then Kruger said softly, If anyone asks who helped you, I'll tell them no one, Henderson said. A faint smile touched Kruger's mouth. Then perhaps both of us survive. He turned away, disappearing into the maze of shattered streets. Henderson watched until the dark swallowed him. Then he walked west. He traveled for 2 days through the outskirts, moving by night, hiding by day. Once he stole a coat from a laundry line. Another time he shared a loaf with 2 Polish workers escaping the city. The sound of frontline artillery grew louder each evening. By the 3rd night, the sky over Potsdam glowed red. The war was coming home. At dawn, he reached a bridge blown in half over the Havel. Allied tanks were visible on the far bank, small silhouettes moving through mist. Between him and them lay open ground, littered with wreckage and snow. He took a breath, stepped from cover, and began to cross the broken span. Halfway across, a German sentry shouted from a pillbox. A burst of machine gun fire shredded the air. Henderson dropped flat, bullets ricocheting off metal. He crawled forward, ribs screaming, until the bridge deck ended in empty space. Below, the river churned dark and cold. He looked once at the opposite bank. Freedom measured in 20 yards. Then he jumped. The shock of the water tore the breath from his chest. He kicked downward, fighting the current, surfacing amid debris. Tracers cut the water around him. He swam until his limbs refused, until the world narrowed to heartbeat and breath. Then strong hands grabbed him under the arms and hauled him ashore. Voices. English. We've got him. Christ, he's ours. He coughed river water and smoke, eyes blinking against daylight. Above him stood a soldier with a red beret badge. Name? Henderson tried to speak, failed, then rasped. Flight Lieutenant James Henderson. Royal Air Force, the soldier grinned. Welcome back, mate. Henderson lay back, staring at the sky. Clouds moved slowly above him, white against blue, the color he'd almost forgotten existed. He whispered once, barely audible over the wind. You. They flew him out 2 days later in a Dakota transport. From the window he saw Berlin receding, a field of smoke and ruin stitched with rivers. Somewhere down there walked a man in a dark coat carrying the memory of a single word. England looked unreal from the air. The green fields below seemed painted, too soft, too clean to be real after Berlin's blackened bones. As the Dakota transport banked over the channel, Henderson felt the sunlight through the small round window and didn't know whether to laugh or sleep. For the first time in months, the air smelled of salt instead of ash. When the plane touched down at RAF Lynham, a medic was waiting with a blanket and tea so hot it scalded his lips. A camera flashed somewhere, official documentation of a returning prisoner, but the light didn't reach his eyes. He had not spoken since the crossing, only nodded when addressed. Words felt fragile things now, too easily wasted. They sent him to a rehabilitation ward outside London. The hospital smelled of disinfectant and wet wool. Rows of men lay in white beds, some missing limbs, some staring at ceilings as if decoding invisible maps. A nurse asked his name and he recited it automatically. Flight Lieutenant James Alistair Henderson, 401267. She smiled kindly, unaware that the repetition was the only rhythm he had left. Weeks passed in silence. He learned to eat without trembling, to sleep more than an hour. Doctors called it recovery. He called it waiting. Outside the windows, spring crept back into England. Children played in the hospital garden among tulips planted before the war. Sometimes he would watch them until dusk, the laughter echoing faintly like a sound remembered from another life. Then, one morning in June, a colonel arrived with a file. He wore the uniform of the War Crimes Liaison Office, a new department full of new orders. "Henderson," he said briskly, "your debriefing's complete. Command wants your testimony in Nuremberg. You were held at a Gestapo facility in Berlin, correct?" Henderson nodded once. The colonel flipped through papers. "We've got names, Weber, Kruger, others. Kruger's been detained by the Americans. He's on the list for questioning." The name hit like a pulse. "Kruger, still alive." The colonel closed the file. "You'll receive summons in a fortnight. Rest while you can, Flight Lieutenant." He left. The door clicked shut. Henderson sat staring at his reflection in the teacup's surface until the ripples steadied into the outline of his own face. 2 weeks later, he boarded a military lorry bound for Germany again, this time as witness rather than captive. The journey took 3 days through France and into the ruins of the Reich. Everywhere along the road, villages lay silent under dust, church spires leaning like spent matchsticks. When they entered Nuremberg, the city looked as though it had been bombed from the inside out. Walls peeled open, streets littered with stone ribs, and in the center the courthouse, intact, stern, a single building demanding order from chaos. Inside, British officers moved briskly through corridors smelling of ink and fatigue. Interpreters whispered in half a dozen languages. A clerk led Henderson to a waiting room with peeling paint and a single window that faced the shattered skyline. He waited for hours until an American MP appeared. "Lieutenant Henderson?" "They're ready." The MP guided him through a hall lined with guards to a small chamber. Bare table, 2 chairs, a tape recorder humming faintly. Across the table sat Herr Kruger, older now, thinner, his hands bound in front of him. No uniform, just a plain gray suit that hung loose on his frame. His eyes, once pale and calculating, were dull as weathered glass. For a long time, neither spoke. Finally, Kruger said, "You look well." Henderson studied him. "You don't." A faint smile crossed the German's lips. "Prison agrees with no one." The interpreter shifted uneasily. "You may begin when ready, Lieutenant." Henderson looked at Kruger. "They'll ask me what happened in that room." "What you did?" Kruger nodded. "And you will tell them." "Yes." "Good, it should be told." Henderson frowned. "Why help them?" Kruger's voice was quiet, stripped of command. "Because truth is all that's left to barter. The Reich is gone. The uniforms, the slogans, they were the noise between silences. You were right. It was always us, men." He paused, eyes drifting toward the recorder. "When I heard they found you alive, I wondered whether you'd keep the word." Henderson said, "I did." "And now?" "I still do." Kruger nodded once. "Then perhaps there's hope for both of us." The interrogation lasted 2 hours. Henderson answered each question with the precision of a navigator. The dates, the methods, the conversations. He did not embellish, did not soften. Kruger listened without protest, confirming details when asked. At the end, the clerk clicked off the machine. The silence afterward felt enormous. The MP rose. "That's all for today." As they prepared to lead Kruger away, he turned to Henderson. "May I ask one thing?" Henderson hesitated, then nodded. Kruger's gaze held steady. "Do you still believe I will hear that word?" Henderson considered. "Every man hears himself in the end." Kruger smiled faintly. "Then I am already deaf." They took him away. That night, Henderson walked through the ruins outside the courthouse. Moonlight glimmered on broken stone. He passed a burned-out tram car half buried in rubble. Graffiti scrawled across its side in chalk, "Nie wieder Krieg," never again war. The handwriting was childish, but the words were enough. He stopped at what had once been a bridge. The river below ran slow and black. He thought of the one he'd jumped from, the cold that had nearly taken him. He remembered Kruger's hand trembling around a cigarette, the disbelief when a prisoner had answered cruelty with calm, and he realized then what the single word had really meant. It hadn't been accusation. It had been reflection. You're guilty, not you'll pay, but you exist. You choose. The most unbearable truth. Months passed. The trials continued. Some of the men from WWII were sentenced to years, others to death. Kruger received 10 years. Henderson read the verdict in a newspaper, folded it, and placed it in a drawer. He never spoke of it again. He left the service in 1947, returning to Dover. The sea was still there. The wind still smelled of salt and rust, but everything else felt smaller. He worked at the postal depot. Quiet work, sorting letters, his hand steady now. Sometimes he would pause over an envelope addressed in careful handwriting and think of the photograph once stolen and returned only by memory. His sister smiling in front of the cottage. Unbroken by time, he never married. Some nights, when storms rolled in from France, he would sit by the window with the lights off, listening to the rain, hearing again the rhythm of engines above cloud. In those moments, the war returned not as fear, but as echo. And in that echo, a word. In 1956, a letter arrived bearing a German postmark.
Inside was a single sheet of paper typed unsigned, "Lieutenant Henderson, you were right."
The word followed me. I heard it in every silence, in every mirror. I have come to understand that forgiveness is not the absence of guilt, but the acceptance of it. If I ever see England again, it will be only as a man who remembers. You know who? He folded the letter carefully, placed it beside the old photograph, and said aloud to the empty room, "Yes, I do." Years later, long after both men were gone, an archivist in London found the recording of their Nuremberg session. The tape hissed with age, but the voices remained clear. A male voice, measured and weary, spoke the final exchange. Interviewer: "Lieutenant Henderson, is there anything you wish to add for the record?" Henderson: "Only this. Words can wound or heal. In that room, one word did both." Interviewer: "And that word was?" Henderson: "You." The rest was silence.